I had a realization recently about the core of the reason that I've continually replayed the original Dark Souls over the last 14 years. I'm not a particularly nostalgic person, and I don't tend to replay games over and over again, but Dark Souls is probably the game that I've most consistently returned to in the last 15 years. It's not my favorite Fromsoft game, not by a long shot, and yet it's the one that I feel the strongest pull to go back to and tinker with from time to time. The game's reputation is fundamentally tied to its difficulty, but here's the realization that I had in my last playthrough. My love of this game is only really indirectly related to its difficulty. I don't really love that the game is difficult, I love the specific way that its difficulty incentivizes me to invest completely in its world. You see, if I'm honest, at this point I don't find Dark Souls to be particularly difficult, especially in comparison to later FromSoft titles. During the playthrough that I did for this review, I forgot about the fact that defeating the last boss in the base game locks you out of starting the DLC, which meant that I needed to beat the first half of the game on a New Game Plus run in order to enter the DLC area. At this point though, I was warmed up. I was in the right state of mind to achieve success in the game. I knew my moveset intuitively, and I knew what all of the enemies that I would face along the way were capable of. It took me about 2 hours from the time I started the game to beat Ornstein and Smough, which opened up the option to start the DLC. When I first played this game at the time of its release, it would have taken me days to hit that same point because I was still sort of letting the premise of the game sink in. I was still in the process of figuring out what the systems of the game were trying to tell me. When I returned to the game after a few years of not playing it, my runs always start the same way, with death after death to basic enemies that I told myself posed no threat to me whatsoever. It always takes me an hour or so to re-enter the correct state of mind. These enemies paradoxically are very easy to defeat, but only if you treat them as worthy adversaries. The game can become a fairly easy experience, but this is only really the case if you take the world seriously, if you start to view combat encounters as learning opportunities, if you consider every step around every corner carefully, and if you experiment thoroughly with all of the game's systems. I don't love Dark Souls because it's difficult, I love it because its difficulty creates a very clean relationship between the attention that I pay to it and how well I do in the game. It's only when I stop thinking about the game as a game and I completely accept its premise that I start to make real progress. Once I accept that everything in this world can and will kill me, once I start thinking carefully about all of my moves, and once I start seeing every combat encounter as an opportunity to learn how an enemy operates, it isn't just that I start to do better in the game, I completely forget about who and where I am, and I become completely captured by the experience. The difficulty of this game is a very specific type of difficulty. It's a difficulty whose purpose is to shift you into a kind of flow state. It's a flow state that I find so enjoyable that I keep coming back to the game despite how much I hate this part. And this part. And especially, God, this is the shittiest part by far. But I push through those parts because the rest of the experience is just so intoxicating, so consuming. It does something for me that few games have ever done so effectively. When it's firing on all cylinders, Dark Souls achieves total capture of my conscious mind. I totally surrender to its illusion and become 100% invested in the experience. Dark Souls has a fascinating and rich lore that it would be a total waste of time to try to comprehensively lay out here, but if you're interested in the worlds and settings of the Souls series of games and you aren't subscribed to VaatiVidya, just know that you're doing it wrong. But as my review system works, the outright quality and density of the story isn't really the relevant part. What's more important is how you experience the story, how it's communicated visually as well as mechanically. I'd describe the process of exploring the world of Lordran and unearthing all of its secrets as fascinatingly impenetrable. The game drops you into a world marked by fairly straightforward medieval dark fantasy scenery with muted colors and enemies that seem to basically fit this aesthetic, if maybe with a bit of a Japanese fantasy twist. But as you start to explore this world, this aesthetic will eventually give way to stunningly ornate high Gothic architecture, naturalistic mystical architecture, and weird kind of Southeast Asian architecture that all hold clues about the people and forces that have made this world so bizarre and oppressive. The varying states of decay that you find these locations in also tell you quite a bit about what went wrong in these societies. At a very macro level, what you see as you progress through the world of Lordran is that the people who rule it on paper sort of bit off more than they can chew when they decided to usurp the previous ruling order. There are ancient primordial forces at play in Lordran that predate its official rulers by millennia, and it seems that they were never really able to contend with these forces properly. What's so fantastic about this setting couldn't be fully appreciated if you just watched a lore video. The most compelling thing is how the mystery unravels, how you feel at all times like something just isn't right in a way that you can almost put your finger on but can't quite. The very orderly and intricate architecture that you see on the surface seems to have been built on top of something ancient and unknowable. The fact that there are whole regions of the world that seem to lack this orderly medieval architecture altogether, and whose residents seem totally indifferent to the affairs of the official rulers, just hint to you that the established order is nowhere near as powerful as the forces that predate them. You see evidence all through the game of the desperate efforts that this order has taken in order to try to hold ancient forces at bay. One entire area of the game was intentionally flooded in an attempt to contain a particularly problematic element of primordial Lordran, and completing the game will require you to drain this area out and find the very source of the dark power that emanates from it. The power discrepancy between the new order and the ancient forces that they're contending with is also communicated by the primary gameplay mechanic of combat. The fights against the remaining lords of Lordran are total cakewalks compared to the fights involving the more ancient entities that predate them. I love the fact that the game never outright tells you that the rulers of Lordran are fighting a futile battle against enemies that they have no hope of defeating. It's a story that plays out in your own mind that starts as a vague feeling of unease and slowly starts to take a more coherent form. My favorite bit of storytelling in the game comes in the city of Anor Londo, this grand opulent city built as a symbol of the power of the ruling order. When I first played this game having no idea what was coming, this reveal was a real shocker. The whole world so far had seemed like it was in the process of just fading to dust, but this city appears as something of a paradise. It's this isolated little bubble within which the rules of entropy don't seem to apply. The presentation of this city just slam dunks its intended effect. You start to entertain the idea that the power of the people who created this utopia might be significant enough to match the power of the ancient evil that they're combating. But more curious players can discover, if they're willing to dig around a bit, that the stunning vista that you encounter when you enter the city is a carefully constructed facade. Attacking the last remaining lord of the city reveals that this person was a mirage, that the actual ruler left a long time ago, and that the sunlight that the city basks in was nothing but an illusion meant to create the impression that the ruling order was still alive and well. Anor Londo is the equivalent of the fat kid that North Korea pulls out anytime that foreign journalists show up in order to create the impression that the whole country's just drowning in Big Macs and Cadbury eggs. As you explore this world, you'll encounter a number of characters who have storylines that unfold as you achieve progress in the world, and the decisions that you've made in the game regarding how you progress your character and which factions in the game you decide to align yourself with will have drastic consequences for the paths that these characters will take through the game. Choosing to invest in one of these storylines and to try to nudge these characters towards positive outcomes can bring enormous rewards to the player, but depending on your build choices, some of them are likely to be totally irrelevant. What this means is that every time you replay the game following a different style or build, you have a big incentive to explore a new element of the game's story that you never saw before, to advance quest lines that you had ignored and see a totally new part of the world. I've now beaten the game 4 times, and I don't think that I've seen anywhere close to half the content of the game, which means every time I come back to it, it doesn't feel like I'm going back to an old game out of nostalgia. It feels like I'm digging a little bit deeper into something that's so deep I'm never likely to see the bottom of the well. In terms of the technical elements of the game's presentation, I'd say it's aged way better than most of its contemporaries, but it does show its age a bit, especially when you compare its animation quality to that of later Fromsoft titles. However, the world does look and sound fantastic. Everything has a phenomenal degree of texture and detail, and the lighting is generally very effective. Descents into dark hallways and tunnels make you feel very uneasy, and this isn't just because they're filled with enemies that will get the drop on you if you aren't careful. The air itself in these environments just seems hostile in some way. If I reviewed this game when it came out using this score system, my score here would have likely been near perfect, but I've frankly been spoiled by later Fromsoft games, and Elden Ring in particular, and I need to reserve 9s and 10s for games that just blew me out of the water here. I think that this game was and is great in this category though. One of the absolute best things about Dark Souls is the fact that all the way through it, you're constantly making meaningful decisions that totally change how the game plays out. I think that in a fundamental sense, the difficulty of the game is a bit overstated, especially in comparison to later Fromsoft games, but make no mistake, it is a hard game, and the player therefore has a strong incentive to carefully weigh the decisions that they make. Dark Souls is an action RPG at heart, and success in the game is a combination of learning all of the combat systems of the game and making smart decisions about how you equip and level up your character. Let's say that you've started out as a character using a shield with a one-handed sword. The shield allows you to avoid incoming damage, but it means that your stamina pool becomes very important. If blocking attacks is going to be your bread and butter, then you need very high stamina to be able to absorb all the blows of your enemies. The currency in the game comes in the form of souls, either gathered by finding them as consumable resources in the world or by defeating enemies directly, with more powerful enemies yielding greater soul rewards. You use these souls both to level up your character and to purchase goods and services from the various NPCs that you'll meet in the course of your adventure. Acquiring souls is difficult, which means that you need to think very carefully about how you want to use them to level up your character, and when an item that a merchant is selling looks powerful enough to be worth foregoing the leveling up that you could do instead. A shield-bearing character will have to make some sacrifices to stats affecting their damage output and survivability in order to maintain the stamina that they need for the build to be effective. They also might need to outright forego the use of ranged weaponry or magic in order to achieve the stats they need to use a shield while also having adequate protection and damage output. It becomes extremely important in this playstyle to not get too greedy in trying to exploit enemies' openings, because you always need some stamina on reserve to block a retaliatory strike. This is especially true if you've decided to combine your use of a shield with heavier armor. This means that you'll take less damage in cases where you are hit, but it also makes it harder to outright avoid damage because heavier equip loads make you move slower, and it makes your dodge animation take longer and cover less distance. If you decide to play this way, you need to heavily invest in stamina and equip load, and you need to get really good at balancing the risk-reward trade-off of doing a lot of damage against reserving enough stamina so that you aren't totally screwed if an enemy launches a counterattack. And because you've developed a very specific playstyle that creates a problem unique to you and your character, it helps you to identify which items out of the hundreds you'll find in the game that will make your job easier. One of the things that I really hate in action RPGs is the feeling that my inventory is just full of items that I'd need to bust out an Excel spreadsheet to figure out which one will most benefit my character, but this has never been the case for me in Dark Souls. Every character that I've ever made in this game has had pretty obvious strengths and shortcomings, so the process of choosing gear to alleviate my weaknesses or enhance my strengths has always been fairly intuitive. If you're a stamina-hungry character, the Grasscrest Shield, Chloranthy Ring, and Mask of the Child will all increase your stamina regeneration, but they'll also require you to forego the use of other items that could benefit your survivability or damage output. So you just have to ask yourself, what's killing me more often? Is it a lack of stamina, a lack of damage resistance, or the fact that I do too little damage in my attacks to be able to mitigate crowds effectively? The answer to this question is likely to change from encounter to encounter or even from area to area, so you have an incentive to constantly experiment with different items. In Blighttown, for instance, you might want to wear gear that offers you good protection against toxicity, but spoiler alert, you might end up switching to fire protection pretty soon after that. If you want to enhance your stamina recovery while keeping your resistances and your damage output high, you can do this with pyromancy, but it'll require you to explore the world a bit to find the right spell. This gives you a strong incentive as you explore the world to not just plow through it, to look around and see if anything appears to be out of place, because many secrets are hidden in the world of Lordran that require you to pause a bit and study your environment. Aiding you a bit in this process is the game's cooperative multiplayer element, the most prominent feature of which are player-created messages that you'll find scattered around the world. You can create messages that warn players of impending danger, or that point out a hidden secret that will aid others in progressing through the game, and you'll receive a little health boost every time that another player gives your message a thumbs up. Just be fairly warned though that this is just as often used by the community to troll new players as it is to offer genuine advice. You'll also find that they're frequently used for purposes of innuendo, which just kind of makes this dark medieval fantasy feel like it's in some way connected to a YouTube comment thread. Jesus fucking Christ. They don't have this shit in Lies of P. As I've played this game over the years, I've gravitated towards mostly the opposite of the playstyle that I was just describing. I like to be a kinda glass cannon. I like moving very quickly with a weapon that does a high amount of damage, with my success in the game being defined by my ability to read enemies carefully and correctly time my high commitment attacks so that they don't result in retaliatory strikes. I just really like both the benefits and the limitations that this playstyle brings. In this playstyle, you have to be very aware of your surroundings, as wide sweeping attacks, for instance, become ineffective in narrow hallways. It also means that you really need to control the space of your engagements carefully, because your attacks have long buildups that leave you vulnerable. It makes agile enemies with quick thrusting attacks a serious obstacle, as they can very quickly poke you every time you wind up an attack. However, by experimenting with your moveset, you can pretty quickly start to piece together how you can time your attacks so that these enemies are denied counter windows. In my most recent playthrough, I decided to use my favorite weapon in the game, which is the Zweihander. Broadly speaking, the community considers this to be a totally viable weapon, but nowhere near one of the best weapons in the game, but I just love it. It works well with the way that I think about fights. I understand its moveset intuitively, and I find it flexible enough to allow me to handle just about any encounter in the game if I select the right move. I find the fact that I can't just R1 spam my way through the whole game with it to be half of the enjoyment. But at the same time, there are a lot of cases that I found its slowness to be a bit of an impediment. Anytime an enemy was either very tall or had an ability that could lift it off the ground, my sweeping R1 attack became completely ineffective, which meant that I was forced to rely on my high arcing heavy attack, which is very slow and easily punishable by faster enemies. I found myself wanting a weapon with a moveset that nicely complemented the Zweihander and addressed its weaknesses, and this presented a very interesting challenge. You see, the materials that you use to upgrade your weapons and armor are finite, and the higher level your weapon gets, the more upgrade materials you'll need to hit every subsequent upgrade. This meant that if I wanted to use several different weapon types to give myself a broad range of capabilities, I had a tough choice to make. I couldn't use the same upgrade path that my Zweihander used, or else I'd be cutting off my ability to get my main weapon fully upgraded. Fortunately though, the upgrade paths for your weapon have the potential to branch in different directions that all use different upgrade materials. Generally speaking, to maximize your damage output, the best way to do this is to choose a weapon with good base stat scaling and to fully upgrade that weapon down the traditional upgrade path. But another option you have is to forego stat scaling and add static elemental effects to your weapons, which makes them uniquely effective against some enemies and less effective against others. It also means though that these weapons no longer compete with each other for upgrade materials. But here's the thing though, I'm a simple man, and I don't like spending a bunch of time in menus. I like to bop enemies on the head with a heavy weapon and do a ton of damage. I decided to solve my Zweihander problem by investing heavily in one alternative weapon whose moveset was just nicely complementary to the shortcomings of the Zweihander. I settled on the Gargoyle Halberd for its quick high-arcing R1 attack that allowed me to exploit short openings without having to worry too much about my surroundings. I also really valued the fact that its sweeping R2 attack turned annoying packs of enemies into very straightforward soul farming opportunities. Even though it used the same upgrade materials as my Zweihander, it worked because these were the only two weapons that I used for the whole game, and what I loved about this solution is that it felt very unique to me. It just worked well with my playstyle. It was by no means the obvious or most meta way of building my character, but I really enjoyed it and found it to be very effective. However, every solution in the game is itself another problem. For instance, I really love the black iron armor set in the game. It's my favorite armor both because it has high defense for its weight and because it just looks so fucking cool. But as a Dark Souls player, I also ride or die with fast roll. Once you get used to being able to quickly dodge attacks, it's really hard to go back. I needed some dexterity investment to be able to effectively use the Gargoyle Halberd, which meant that I had to pick and choose which pieces of this armor set I wanted to wear, as I couldn't wear the whole thing and maintain fast roll if I also wanted to dump points into dexterity. But this just enhanced the degree to which this character felt like my character. My dollar store black iron set was mine. It was tuned to give me the specific combat characteristics that most mattered to me. If you watch 10 Dark Souls streams or Let's Plays, you'll probably see 10 totally different playstyles and 10 characters that all look completely different, and this is a big part of what makes this game so enjoyable and replayable. For instance, if you play this game as a sorcerer or a faith user with your magical abilities being the pillar of your playstyle, then you're playing a fundamentally different game from a melee character. The one magic playthrough that I ever did in the game left me feeling like a total pushover at the start, but once I'd explored enough to find the right items and spells and increase my base stats enough, I ended up feeling like Neo at the end of the Matrix. Regardless of how you play the game though, you're guaranteed to be regularly faced with tense decisions regarding how to best use scarce resources. You bank progress as you move through the game by lighting bonfires that serve both as checkpoints and as places to heal and level up your character. Resting at one of these bonfires refills your Estus flasks, the primary healing item of the game that you get 5 of by default when you rest at a bonfire. As you're out exploring the world, you're constantly faced with the following dilemma. Do you want to fully heal your character after you take damage, which will inefficiently use one of your flasks, or do you want to leave yourself with a little bit of damage on your health bar so that the next time you take damage, you use the Estus more efficiently? You can upgrade any bonfire in the game by kindling it with a consumable resource, but this has 2 consequences. First of all, it requires that you enter human form, which makes you a target for invasion, the PvP element of the game that allows other players to enter your world to try to kill you. Second, it uses a finite and valuable resource, a resource that you can also use to increase your damage scaling with a specific class of weapon. You're therefore incentivized to think very carefully about which bonfires in the world you want to kindle. Your best move is typically going to be to only kindle the bonfires in areas that are serving as major barriers to progress. Humanity is just one of roughly 40 consumable resources that you can find or purchase in the world, and they all have situationally useful roles. But it behooves the player to not use these willy-nilly. Using a bomb on a single enemy, for instance, wastes the damage potential that could have been applied to a group of enemies. Your magical abilities also have limited uses that reset every time you rest at a bonfire, so you need to be very strategic about when you use these abilities. If you use one of these abilities on an enemy you could have otherwise easily defeated, you might not have that ability later on when you encounter some problem that ability uniquely solves. I've always said that a high score in this category roughly tracks with the extent to which your playthrough felt unique to you, that you were able to apply unique methods of problem solving that deeply tapped into your own personal strengths and weaknesses. In this regard, I think that Dark Souls is just about as good as a game can be without cracking that fabled perfect score. Every time that I've ever played it, it's felt like a totally fresh experience, and I'm sure that I'm still going to be replaying this game 10 years from now. I mentioned at the outset of this review that I think the difficulty of Dark Souls has been a bit overstated for marketing purposes. After finishing the base game in my most recent playthrough, I realized that I needed to defeat Ornstein and Smaug in a New Game Plus run in order to be able to start the DLC, and it took me about 2 hours from game start to achieve this. By the point I had finished my first playthrough, I was warmed up. I instinctively understood the moves of all of the enemies in the game that I was going to run into, and I was completely under the spell of the game. It wasn't so much that I was even trying to go fast, it was more that having played this game for this long, adhering to all of its rules, and getting into a kind of flow state, the result of that was just that I naturally made quick progress. After I finished the DLC, I didn't play the game again for roughly a month, and then I decided to start a cleric character for the sake of tinkering around a bit with the miracle system. This playthrough started the exact same way that Dark Souls playthroughs always start when I haven't played the game for a while. Death after death after death, resulting from my not taking the game seriously. From thinking, I've already beaten this game 4 times, so I don't need to worry about these little vegan fuckers anymore. When I consciously try to play the game quickly, I end up playing it very impulsively, which leads to dumb, avoidable deaths. It typically takes about an hour of this until I find this inner voice that just reminds me, dude, you've forgotten which game you're playing. You need to slow everything down and take every enemy seriously. The thing about Dark Souls is that it does everything it can early in the game to tell you with its world and encounter design that you need to do exactly this to survive. The first boss fight in the game is one that you're supposed to recognize that you can skip and come back to later when you have better gear, which just teaches you that you should never stop studying your surroundings. Early in the game, environmental hazards trigger as you move forward, which just hints to you that you're supposed to consider every step carefully. Enemies jump out of hiding and try to ambush you, which ought to prompt you to realize that a fleeing enemy could just as easily be leading you to an ambush as it could be actually fleeing. These scripted sequences that show the appearance of a massive, intimidating enemy, as well as the repeated teaching sequences designed to punish you for not studying the environment before proceeding, are supposed to drill into your mind that this is a game that you need to pay attention to. And the game doesn't just offer punishment for failing to pay attention, it's filled to the brim with rewards for players who slow down and say, hey, wait a minute, what's behind that barrel? Or, can I get on top of that ledge? Or, what happens if I redirect these rolling boulders down this path? These actions frequently result in item or questline rewards with the potential to completely transform how you proceed through the game. They're massive incentives to go slowly and methodically through every area. But they come with a price tag. You never, ever, ever want to just charge at something that looks like a cool reward. You want to carefully study the ground between you and your prize to see if anything looks out of place. As you start to accept the premise that this is a game about patience, observation, and experimentation, you'll start to tinker with the systems in the game slowly and one by one. You'll realize that weapons don't just have different stats, each has its own completely unique handling dynamics tied to their physical nature. A light and fast weapon is great for exploiting narrow windows of vulnerability, but at the same time they tend to not do a bunch of damage. A heavier weapon, such as Charlie Kelly's Rat Stick, takes way more effort for your character to swing, which means that you're vulnerable for longer when you use it, but it also means that it hits like a freight train and that it staggers enemies. You can discover through experimentation that a consequence of this is you have a totally new way of rendering shield-bearing enemies vulnerable. You start realizing as you tinker with the combat sandbox that the physical rules that apply to you also apply to your enemies. The attacks that are quick and jolty tend not to do a whole lot of damage, and you can pretty easily tell after an enemy performs a heavy attack that they're vulnerable to a counter. You're both anchored by the same physical rules. What's true for you is also true for them. This insight becomes invaluable when you encounter the first serious enemy in the game, a Black Knight guarding what's clearly an item reward. I've never on any of my playthroughs beaten this knight on my first try. I'm always jumpy and nervous, and I dodge at the wrong times and get greedy with my uses of Estus flasks, which the agile knight can very easily punish. But the same learning process that you've applied to get to the Black Knight is also how you'll beat him. You need to study him, to look for openings where, because of his attack commitment and your position relative to him, he won't be able to punish one of your attacks. He's very fast and he hits for a lot of damage, but at the end of the day, his attacks follow predictable rules that are governed by the same intuitive physical logic that's governed every other encounter you've had so far. He does have safe attack windows, and you can learn them if you maintain a cool head and study his movements. In my first playthrough, I think that defeating the Black Knight and getting his item reward was the point at which I was completely sold, when the game really clicked with me. I completely understood the premise of the game at that point. No matter how tough and overwhelming an enemy seems, you can overcome them by carefully considering both the ground that you're fighting on, as well as the consequences of your own moveset and that of the enemy. The Black Knight encounter is followed by another fantastic teaching enemy in Havel. Just looking at him and the weapon that he's carrying, most players are going to get the hint very early that you do not want to get hit by one of his attacks. And yet, if you've learned the lessons that this game has tried to teach you, you've cleared a path behind you so that you can retreat if he starts to overwhelm you, which means that you have the time and the space that you need to study how he moves. And unsurprisingly, he moves pretty slowly. The very thing that makes his attacks so devastating also makes them predictable and readable. The guy basically burns a Snickers bar worth of calories every time he swings his big toothstick around, and he has to put his whole body into the swing. This means that it's very easy to time your dodges, and even though he has incredible physical defenses and a big health bar, it's so trivial to dodge his attacks and punish his openings that he's essentially a cakewalk. As I fought him in my last playthrough, I started to get into a trance state. At the beginning of the fight, I was reflexively dodging every time that he attacked out of pure video game survival instinct. As I kept fighting him though, these instances started coming up where I instinctively knew when I didn't even need to dodge, when I was too far away from him for his attack to connect. Havel's moves are so physically intuitive and predictable that I had started thinking of this fight as an actual fight. I'd started to read him like I would read an actual guy in a suit of armor with a giant club. This combat flow state eventually became the default state of all fights for me. This complete fixation on the enemy, with every fiber of my being dedicated to figuring out what their animation state signals about their ability to harm me. Take Sif the Grey Wolf as an example. If you look at him, you can basically tell what the danger you're going to face is. The danger is the giant sword, and he swings it with his neck, which means that there's a cone of danger in front of his body at all times. This means that if you can time your movements right and get underneath him, you have a totally safe window to attack him. Asterisk. For as long as he stays stationary. The trick to beating him is getting past the sword and then not getting too greedy with trying to exploit the opportunity that you've created. At the end of the day, he's a wolf. He can shift his position around very quickly, so if you lock yourself into a heavy attack animation right as he pulls back, you're gonna have a bad time. But again, I got into a total trance state fighting him because it was so intuitive. Every time I died, I knew exactly what I had done wrong to earn the death, and in every case it was impulsivity, failing to correctly consider the relevant factors in planning an attack. Most of the enemies and bosses in the game follow this pattern. They can either be complete menaces or total pushovers depending on how seriously you take the fight. I'll just restate a point from the start of the video. Dark Souls isn't a great game because of its difficulty. Its difficulty really isn't the point. What the difficulty achieves is it creates a very clean and predictable relationship between how much you invest in the experience and your success in the game. It makes you really buy into the idea that every step forward needs to be carefully considered. I don't love Dark Souls because I love dying or because I need the games that I play to be hard games for serious big dick gamer chads. I love Dark Souls because every time I replay it, it takes about an hour for the setting to set in so completely that I end up here, tippy-toeing forward, stopping to listen constantly to see if any enemies are moving nearby. Knowing that the reward that I see in the distance has the potential to be hugely beneficial, but understanding at the same time that if I charge straight there, I'm likely to end up surrounded and cornered by enemies that will overwhelm me, and that I'll have nobody to blame but myself for the resulting death. Dark Souls puts me into this absolutely primal state of fear and anxiety, and only a small part of that has to do with the visual design of the world and creatures. What keeps me so glued to the screen, what makes my heart rate rise every time that I think that danger could be around the next corner, is this very clear sense that my level of planning, preparation, and focus is precisely what will determine if I succeed or fail.
Holy fuck.
The game isn't conventionally scary whatsoever, save for maybe a small handful of locations, but at the same time, the fact that I know that my resourcefulness or lack thereof is the very thing that will determine if I live or die makes me pay attention to the world in ways that I don't pay attention to other games. This pig enemy isn't that intimidating aesthetically, but the process of trying to plan my exit strategy before starting to fight him and making sure that I won't have enemies at my back should I decide to flee makes him far more intimidating than he has any right to be, purely based on the amount of preparation and consideration that I put into the fight. The other thing that makes him intimidating is the consequence for failure. In Dark Souls, if you die while out exploring, you'll drop all of your souls in your current location, and if you fail to regain those souls on your next life, those souls are permanently lost. It gives you an incentive to think about fighting him in a location where, if he kills you, you'll have an easier time regaining your souls. But this just means that you're fighting him having already considered the possibility of failure, which makes him that much more of a threat in your mind. I mean, fuck, maybe I was wrong. Maybe he is scary. Pushing forward into the unknown in Dark Souls is unbelievably tense. You might, for instance, want to head back to a previous bonfire to level up if you have a lot of souls and no remaining Estus flasks, but at the same time, you know that you might find another bonfire right around the corner. Far more meaningfully, you might uncover a shortcut that will reconnect your current area to a previously explored one, which permanently unlocks new traversal options and allows you to more easily rest at Firelink Shrine, where you get additional Estus flasks when you rest. The thing that really tempts you, though, is that you know that if you play things with a level head and take every step forward carefully, that you have a very good chance of making it to your next goal.
Can I... Oh, you shit lizard.
The predictability and foreseeableness of the danger in Dark Souls is the very thing that tempts you into making these calculated gambles, and it's the same thing that makes the world seem way more real than it has any right to seem. This is something that I touched on in my last review and that I think might be counterintuitive in game design. Dark Souls is such a tense and gripping experience because of how predictable its danger is. If the game were to constantly take delight in trolling you with unintuitive, unforeseeable nonsense, this tension would disappear. The decision would just make itself. You have a lot of souls and no flasks, so of course you're gonna go back to the last bonfire. Gosh, I wonder what this could be setting up. In this category, I'm scoring the degree to which the gameplay elements themselves increased my immersion above and beyond what the aesthetics and writing achieved, and again, the only reason that I can't give the game a perfect score here is that I need to save room for the juggernauts. The illusion that Dark Souls puts me under is so potent and so completely absorbing that the things that suck me out of the experience are especially painful. I'm gonna make serious effort to be dispassionate in this category because immersion breaks are more painful when you've been successfully immersed, so I don't want the fact that the game successfully sucked me into its experience to harm its score. But at the same time, I have to be fair here and say that the experience is a pretty uneven one, especially in the second half of the game. The most painful experience in Dark Souls and Souls games more generally is when that magical, all-consuming trance state is shattered by something that feels video gamey. Here are some not a big deal, sort of small fry examples of this. Enemies and environmental hazards in the game that your intuition would tell you need to be moving fast to harm you, in reality just have hitboxes around them that harm you regardless of the state of motion of the object. I mean, who cares, right? It's a 14-year-old game, it's gonna have a quirk or two like that. These sorts of quirks represent an occasion where the illusion that the game has you under just sort of temporarily suspends itself. It's annoying, but it's not outright painful. You'll see a bunch of little things like this in a playthrough of Dark Souls. Enemy AI will bug out and lose interest in you, enemies will clip through the floor, and frequently the AI pathing is not really good enough to let you maintain the illusion that you're fighting actual creatures. In fact, a surprisingly effective way to farm souls in the game is to just take a walk in Blighttown and wait for enemies to fall to their death trying to reach you. One point of pain in this game that I didn't feel when I first played it, but that stands out like a sore thumb after playing newer Fromsoft games, is the fact that dodging's restricted to 4 cardinal directions when you're locked on. If you're returning to Dark Souls after playing Elden Ring, for instance, just know that there are going to be some cases where you instinctively try to dodge diagonally, and the game interprets that as being closer to a sideways dodge. The most iconic fight in the game by far is Ornstein and Smough, the boss fight that wraps up the first half of the game when you reach the end of Anor Londo. This is widely regarded as the first very difficult fight in the game, and there's a sense that this is true. In the first phase, you're fighting two enemies at once, and in the second phase, you fight a more powerful version of whichever boss you didn't eliminate first. Sounds hard, right? Well, it can be, but I'm gonna let you in on a secret. Phase 2 of this fight is essentially optional. If you kill Ornstein first, which a huge majority of players will, purely because it's easier to isolate him on the basis of his speed, you end up fighting Smough alone in Phase 2. During the first phase, you probably learn to rely on the big pillars to block his movement during his charge attacks. The destructibility of these pillars is supposed to draw your attention to them as a tactic. But once you get to the solo fight with Smough, you get to focus on him with 100% of your attention, and there's nothing stopping you from realizing that he has absolutely no idea what to do about these pillars if you position yourself on the other side of one. You might discover, without making any conscious effort to cheese the game, that you can just sit behind a pillar and bait attacks out of him that draw very clear punish windows, which you can just rinse and repeat until he dies. Again, instances like this are just a bit disappointing. They ruin the spell a bit, but they aren't that severe or that common. A more pervasive problem in the game is something that every Fromsoft game since Dark Souls has tried one solution or another to try to fix, what I would call pirate mode. You prioritize the booty. Way too many enemies in the game are trivializable by going for their butts, either because they do way too little to stop you from cheesing them for backstabs, or because they just have no idea what to do if you sit behind them, bait attacks out of them, and just whack their butts when a safe window appears. This is admittedly a tough problem to solve. The problem is that it's hard to make enemies not suffer from some degree of this problem without sacrificing the readability and predictability that makes these fights so immersive. An enemy that can just pivot track you, for instance, is not one that it's easy to imagine being a real enemy. Sekiro and Bloodborne solve this problem by increasing the mobility and agility of your enemies, but they balance this by giving you more tools for countering this agility. Dark Souls 3 really focused on enhancing the quality of enemy AI and animation, making them more dynamic and responsive. Dark Souls 2 solved this problem by making you fight 7 of every fucking enemy in every encounter that all aggro in packs and attack you simultaneously, but it still suffered from this issue pretty severely in one-on-one combat. The combat in Dark Souls has the potential to be completely intoxicating and absorbing, and it's just unfortunate how often the correct solution to an encounter is to remember that you're playing a video game, put on Sir Mix-a-Lot, and just go to town. The experiences that I've just listed are examples of oversights. They're things that just sort of slipped through. They aren't really that big of a deal, and in fact, if they were the only problems that I had with the game, I'd probably give it something like an 8 out of 10 in this category. Unfortunately, I had just as big of a problem with overt design decisions that just made me kind of scratch my head and pulled me out of the experience. Some of the most absorbing and enthralling experiences in the game were sequences that were stressful and thrilling in a way that seemed naturally baked into the premise of the setting. In the drained out bottom of New Londo Ruins, for instance, you're walking into an area that was flooded specifically to seal in some dark, evil shit, and you're also in a damp, dark, claustrophobic environment with poor visibility, so it seems natural that you need to be very careful here. In Darkroot Forest, the fact that it's nighttime, there's fog in the air, and the enemies that you're fighting naturally camouflage with the environment makes you have to rely on sound to cue you to stop advancing and fight the enemies that are currently approaching. And again, this tension just feels natural. Unfortunately though, there were a lot of cases for me where the tension stopped feeling natural. In Sen's Fortress, these sequences where you have to run across a bridge while there are axes swinging back and forth and enemies that are shooting at you to try to stun you so the axes hit you, and if you do get hit, you fall into a sludge pit that slows your movement, that's also full of demons, and there's guys above that are shooting down at you. Well, these are clear-cut cases where the immersion snaps, and you're reminded that you're now playing that part of the game. Fortunately though, this was about the only sequence in the first half of the game that I really didn't like. However, the second half of the game was a completely different story. It's very clear that far more time, effort, and thought was put into the first half of the game than the second half. Gimmicks of the type where the difficulty stops seeming baked into the premise and seems to have been artificially added by the developer to make you experiment with some trinket or mechanic just feel unbelievably video gamey. Bosses start boiling down to here's the same boss that you fought twice already, but it's red now. Or they're based around dumb gimmicks that can only kill you out of pure surprise at how out of left field the encounter feels.
What in the fuck?
The first time that you encounter an enemy that was previously used as a boss out in the overworld, you're like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool. It's a neat way to show how much better I've gotten at the game. I've grown in power so much that this guy that used to torment me is now easy to deal with. And then you turn around the very next corner and realize that is not what's going on here at all. What's going on here is someone at Fromsoft said, shit guys, the game's due tomorrow, and they started to hit Control-C, Control-V on enemies that they'd already developed into any space that needed some, quote, difficulty. The worst part of the game by far is Lost Izalith, an area whose premise is that the whole world is lava and there's 8 trillion dragons to fight. I don't think it's an exaggeration at all to say that if Lost Izalith had just been removed from the game and replaced with nothing, it would have significantly improved the game. The last category of problems that I had with the game really only surfaced in the DLC. The 3 hardest bosses in the game are the 3 bosses at the end of that DLC. The problem that I had with these bosses wasn't that they were difficult. In the scheme of the Fromsoft catalog as a whole, none of these bosses would crack the top 20 hardest Souls bosses. What I didn't like about these bosses was that they were difficult in a way that made fighting them unenjoyable. I want to go back to the point that I made about Havel a little earlier. What made that fight so immersive was the fact that he was intuitively understandable. His strengths and his weaknesses were baked right into his physicality. He's unbelievably strong, but that makes his attacks slow and readable. I want to be clear that I'm not saying that every fight in every Souls game should be just like Havel. I'm saying that the fight became enjoyable because of the fact that I could rely on my physical intuition to read him. I got into this immersive trance state fighting him where I knew when I didn't even need to dodge him, because I knew exactly what he was capable of. The same idea was true for Sif the Grey Wolf. Everything that you need to know about how he hurts you is baked into the premise. He's a wolf with a giant sword. He's really fast, and he swings that sword in wide arcing sweeps. The Sif fight would have been harder if the developers added an attack where he threw the sword at you like a boomerang. It would be just one more thing that you had to be aware of and manage, and at the same time, it would kill the immersion of the fight. It would make you stop using the parts of your brain that read motion and judge distance, and make you start memorizing tells. It would force you to view Sif as a character in a video game, not as a wolf with a giant sword. In short, it would kill the magical flow state. It would make you start to use parts of your brain that studies for exams rather than the parts related to instinct and feeling. And that's exactly what these 3 fights did for me. They made me feel like I had to cram for a test. Artorias and Manus were both difficult for basically the same reason. The timing of their attacks seemed just deeply unintuitive. They didn't follow the Havel model, where an attack is naturally preceded by tells that his muscles are winding up, so danger is coming. They sort of wound up and then suddenly released, meaning that every time I saw one queue up, I had to say, okay, 1, 2, 3, dodge. Calamite was both the hardest boss in the game and my least favorite boss in the game by a big margin. I didn't die on Calamite nearly as many times as I did on Dark Souls 3 Slave Knight Gale or Sekiro's Ishin, and those are my 2 favorite bosses in all of FromSoft's catalog. What I hated about Calamite was that to beat him, I felt like I needed fucking flashcards. The build up to the fight is phenomenal. You encounter him out in the world before you fight him, which just starts to build the intimidation factor, and you need to do some problem solving out in the overworld in order to render him fightable at all. I like these sort of hidden optional bosses, especially where you get cool rewards for beating them. The fight itself, however, just felt like an absolute chore. I felt like I was studying for a test. If he tilts his head to the right, it means that you can sight read the incoming attack, but if he tilts it to the left, it means that the attack is going to be a delayed spinning attack. And if he does this attack while he's anywhere close to you, you have to have the timing memorized perfectly, because there's no way you're dodging away from it, and you need your iframes to activate at the exact moment the attack connects. Also, during the version of this attack that's sight readable, you have to remember that it isn't necessarily his head swinging that hurts you. The whole front half of his body essentially becomes a hitbox. When he sits up on his haunches, it either means that he's going to breathe fire or he's going to do this weird psychic grab attack, and you can tell which one he's going to do based on whether his eye goes red. Both of these attacks have punish windows, but the move if he's breathing fire is to run straight in, whereas the psychic grab attack requires that you memorize the dimensions in which he can grab you and run around that area. This is true unless you're really close to him, in which case you can run straight in for the punish. So basically, anytime Calamite sits on his haunches, you have to immediately go, okay, is this scenario A or B? And if it's B, does my distance make this subvariant B1 or B2? He sometimes does this ground stomping attack that counters your attempts to punish his openings, and while I don't know what triggers him to do it, at the same time you can memorize which legs he attacks with and in which order. If you don't do this, you're going to sacrifice way too many potential punish windows. And if he squats down into a sprinting pose, you need to immediately orient yourself and figure out if he might run into a wall, because if he does, he'll start his spinning flame attack much sooner than you're expecting and from a closer distance. When you consider the fact that he has an enormous health pool, what the fight boils down to is having all of these things so well memorized that you don't make too many mistakes in a row in the 10 or so minutes that it's going to take you to chip away all of his health. I wasn't even satisfied when I beat him, I was just happy that the whole thing was over. Have you ever watched a boxing match and just had this fantasy that somehow you could be a great boxer? Okay, come on, shut up. I know you've done it. I've done it, you've done it, everybody has done it. Here's my question though, when you watch a boxing match and for some reason you think that you could have won that fight, in this fantasy scenario, did you imagine yourself winning because of your ability to consciously apply a memorized list of if-then contingencies? No, in your Rocky fantasy, you imagined that you'd just intuitively react to his attacks, and that you'd know when to slip your head sideways when you saw his arms move. And you know what? That's a better fantasy. The other one is really lame. Fighting fantasies should be about fighting, not about cracking some scientific formula. I want to be Conan the Barbarian in these fantasies, not Professor fucking Frink. One of my absolute least favorite things in Souls games is difficulty being sought at the expense of what makes the fights intuitive and immersive, and I'm spending a bit of time laying out this criticism here because it'll come back again in my later reviews of some other Fromsoft games. Overall, I'd say that Dark Souls was a slightly above average game in the category of seamlessness. However, what this game does well, it does so well that it's worth slogging through some of the immersion-breaking frustration. There's incredible content in the second half of the game and in the DLC area. And the first half of the game is nearly blemish-free. It's one of my favorite game experiences of all time. I really wish that the game was just more consistently enjoyable without so many of the jarring immersion breaks that fill the second half. That brings the total score for Dark Souls to 32 out of 40, putting it in the must-play category of my review system. The experience is so unique, consuming, and empowering that it's an unbelievably easy recommendation to make. The only caveat that I'd add is that you need to be prepared to have to constantly reevaluate your strategy and to make changes when things aren't working out. The joy in this game comes from being willing and eager at all times to roll with the punches, to study each encounter carefully and apply the lessons that the game is trying to teach you. Sometimes that lesson is a dumb one, like, don't walk that way, you fucking idiot. But more often than not, the lesson is something to do with slowing down, being more observant, and learning to think strategically and methodically under pressure. For purposes of the score leaderboard, I'll choose the leader in cases of a tie, and of the 3 games that have scored a 32 so far, Dark Souls is my favorite, so it now sits at the number 2 spot on the leaderboard. I went and rented a copy of Dark Souls on the day that it released. I didn't have a PS3 when Demon Souls became something of a cult classic, and I always felt like I had missed out on what was very clearly a unique and unforgettable experience. The moment I heard that the sequel was going cross-platform, I marked the release date on my calendar, and I loaded up the original disc Xbox 360 version on day one. And you know what? I defeated. You bet your ass I defeated. It was an experience that changed my taste in video games forever. I had played hard games before, and I felt like I knew what they were all about. But Dark Souls was hard in a different way. It was hard in the sense that I had to conquer bad habits that I'd developed as a gamer. I had to conquer the voice that told me that the first enemies that you meet in the game are cannon fodder meant to help you figure out what all the buttons do. It was hard in the sense that it required me to completely invest in its premise, to accept that the oppressive atmosphere wasn't just some veneer of spookiness like the mansion level in Banjo-Kazooie, that it was a constant reminder of the fact that I was never more than an impulsive move or two away from losing all of my money and progress. But the thing that drew me to the game then is the same thing that keeps bringing me back to it, the pure empowerment that it brings. If you do completely invest in the premise, if you start treating every enemy in the game as a worthy adversary, and if you consider every move that you make carefully, you'll find that in a weird way, the game becomes almost easy. When you stop dodge spamming anytime an enemy moves and start to study them, you start to understand them, to feel at all times like you know exactly what they can do and when it's safe to attack. This is a weirdly zen experience. It goes from feeling tense and stressful to feeling almost relaxing. Rich people have their golf and their helicopter races or whatever the fuck, but I fight demons. It's how I enter the closest thing that I know to a meditative state. It's the activity that totally captures my conscious, fearful, anxiety-prone mind and lets my inner thoughts run wild unobstructed. Lots of my best writing ideas have come to me spontaneously after long sessions of playing Souls games, and I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that there's something magical about an experience that consistently rewards this insane degree of conscious attention and focus. If I'm honest, it's actually the thing that I enjoy the most about these games, the mental freshness that I feel after playing them. I think that concentrating all of my lower-level animal instincts into this all-consuming task leaves them trying to solve those problems while I'm out walking around, rather than inventing new ones over the course of my day just to keep myself occupied. And you know what? I'm a lot happier in life when my base instincts are focused on figuring out how to counter waterfall dance than when I'm trying to figure out if someone complimented me honestly or sarcastically, or if that comet headed towards our solar system is actually an alien spaceship, or if World War III is about to start because someone in Israel found a red cow. I tend to think about these types of things way less when I'm playing a Souls game, and I think that it's all down to how completely and totally the games demand my conscious attention. This is what makes Dark Souls so great. It's not the difficulty per se, it's how you conquer that difficulty. It's the relationship between your attention and your success. Dark Souls is an experience that I think I'll always come back to because there's always more to be learned, more weapon timings to master, more systems to tinker with, more wacky build ideas to try out. Every time that I've come back to it for a replay, it's felt like a fresh experience, and if you haven't played it already, I can't recommend strongly enough that you check it out.